Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating. We're going to unpack how South Korea forged one of the most uniquely terrifying cinematic genres in the entire world, Korean psychological horror. If you've ever watched a K-horror film and just felt that lingering, inescapable dread hanging over you long after the credits rolled, you know exactly what I mean. But how did they actually build this cinematic DNA? Well, let's find out.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really grasp K-horror, we kind of have to contrast it with what we usually see in the Western horror tradition. Western horror often zeroes in on external, fightable monsters, right? You got serial killers, demons you can literally exorcise, or threats built entirely around sudden jump scares and pure shock value. But Korean horror, it operates on a completely different frequency. It leans heavily on supernatural folklore, a deeply lingering psychological dread, and, most importantly, internalized guilt. You can't just fight these monsters with a weapon, because a lot of the time, the demons are inescapable and rooted deep inside the characters themselves.
Section 1. Folklore and Shamanic Roots. To figure out where this intense, internalized dread comes from, we got to travel back a bit to our first core component. A wonhon is a restless or vengeful spirit straight out of traditional Korean folklore. But here is what you really need to take away from this. These aren't just your standard scary ghosts popping out of a closet to say boo. A wonhon is born from profound emotional pain, overwhelming guilt, or a deeply unresolved injustice, something often referred to culturally as han. These spirits literally represent the persistence of unfinished business. They're tragic figures, and seeing them on screen is a direct reflection of cultural beliefs about the afterlife and this cosmic need to balance the scales of justice.
So when you've got these restless spirits roaming around, how do the living actually deal with them? Culturally, that brings us to the gut, a traditional Korean shamanic ritual performed to appease or exorcise these exact entities. And what's just amazing about Korean horror cinema is how filmmakers ground their supernatural fiction in these very real historical practices. They take these ancient, powerful rituals and translate them directly to the screen, creating an incredibly intense, almost suffocating atmosphere.
When modern films like Exhuma or The Mimic depict a gut ritual, they absolutely do not hold back. They bombard you with rapid editing, a restless, constantly moving camera, deafening traditional percussion, and super striking imagery like the blood of a dead pig. It creates this visceral, overwhelming terror. It makes you, the viewer, feel like you're actively participating in this chaotic, ancient rite where the earthly world and the supernatural world are just violently colliding.
Section 2. History, Trauma, and Society.
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because ancient folklore is really only half the story. K-horror's cinematic origins sparked with Kim Ki-young's absolute masterpiece, The Housemaid, back in 1960. But soon after that, South Korea entered a really dark era of strict military censorship through the 1970s and 80s, which heavily repressed the entire film industry. But look what happens when democracy finally takes hold and that censorship is lifted. In 1998, we get this incredible post-censorship renaissance kicking off with Whispering Corridors, which eventually leads us right into the Golden Age peak in 2003 with the release of the iconic A Tale of Two Sisters.
So why does this timeline matter? Well, because when that censorship was finally lifted, filmmakers basically unleashed decades of pent-up societal trauma straight onto the screen. Modern Korean cinema uses the supernatural to critique very real, very grounded horrors. The painful post-colonial legacy of Japanese occupation, the absolutely devastating economic collapse of the 1997 IMF crisis, and even the hyper-competitive, oppressive nature of the educational system, which Whispering Corridors tackled so brilliantly. These films boldly prove that sometimes our modern societal institutions can be way scarier than any ghost.
Section 3. The Psychological and Domestic. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this incredible insight from Kim Ji-woon, who is genuinely one of the master directors of the genre. We've talked about national trauma, sure, but key horror doesn't just stop at the borders of society. It brings the horror terrifyingly close to home. He noted, for Asian horror films, we would reflect or think about the horror coming from inside ourselves. This insight is literally the anchor for everything we're talking about today. It's not about some alien or outsider invading your home. It's the terrifying realization that the call is coming from inside the house, or rather, inside your own mind.
And honestly, no film illustrates this better than Kim Ji-woon's own 2003 masterpiece, A Tale of Two Sisters. The film is actually a loose adaptation of a super famous Joseon-era folktale called Jungha Hongryongjan, which roughly translates to The Story of Roseflower and Red Lotus. It's a classic fable about two sisters and an evil stepmother, but the way he adapted it for the screen is just pure genius.
Because instead of just making the stepmother your standard, cartoonish bad guy, the film reconstructs this old narrative into an intricate, beautiful, gothic exploration of a fractured mind. It dives into dissociative identity disorder, devastating survivor's guilt, and transgenerational trauma. The horror stems entirely from the total breakdown of family reality. It's this incredibly tragic, domestic horror story where the ghost haunting our protagonist is ultimately just the unatoned guilt of her very own past actions.
Section 4, Modern Tech and Digital Dread. But you know, the genre hasn't just stayed trapped in the past. It's constantly evolving, and watching the evolution of fear on screen is fascinating. If the golden age of K-horror was defined by the Gothic era, that slow-burn dread set in old, isolated houses with creepy, spectral music, the modern era is an entirely different beast. Today, we're in the digital era. It's all about real-time live-stream immersion, claustrophobia, and severe techno-paranoia. It literally takes the fears we face in our everyday online lives and weaponizes them against us. And this brilliantly illustrates that shift. The 2018 found-footage film Gonjiam Haunted Asylum. The film follows this online media crew staging a live stream inside a notorious real-life abandoned psychiatric hospital. Through high-definition GoPros, front-facing wide-angle body cameras, and multi-camera perspectives, the horror is driven entirely by the character's sheer greed for real-time internet viewership metrics. That desperate pursuit for online views turns modern technology from a tool of communication into a literal, inescapable trap. You're watching the horror unfold right alongside the fictional live-stream viewers in real time.
And they aren't just innovating visually either. The audio is a whole other level of terrifying. Modern films like this use some incredibly eerie, surreal sound design. For example, they'll isolate a human voice within a frequency range, but surround it with these abnormal, deep, unsettling rumbles. This technique creates a profound sense of apprehension and unease, without having to rely purely on a cheap, sudden jump scare. It just gets right under your skin and stays there.
Section 5. Why K-horror haunts us. So the crucial point is, as we wrap up our analysis, we really have to ask the ultimate question. Why does this specific cinematic DNA hit us so hard? Well, Korean psychological horror serves as an uncompromising mirror. It tells us that the ghosts we fear the absolute most are not supernatural intruders from another realm, but the unaddressed actions of our own past, the structural inequalities of our society, and the guilt we bury deep inside ourselves. They elevate horror into a high art form that demands we look inward. Which leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If K-horror is a mirror reflecting unatoned history, then what unresolved ghosts of the past might be haunting the hallways of your own society today? Think about that the next time you feel a chill in an empty room. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.